This is the Education Exchange with Paul Peterson. I am the director of the program on education policy and governance at Harvard University. Thank you for joining us. The Massachusetts State Department of Education just announced that more students have passed the College Board's advanced placement tests than ever before. These are the tests that are used to assess a student's readiness for college, and it now looks like in Massachusetts, more students are passing that test than in Massachusetts it's ever been done, and indeed in any state where it's ever been done. And this is just wonderful news until one learns that the advanced placement test has been dumbed down. In many subjects, it's easier to get a passing grade of 3 on a test that goes up to 6 than it's ever been. The College Board doesn't deny that the test has been dumbed down, but it says the test must adapt to the easier curriculum in high school and the lower expectations college have for admission. So it's the whole education world that's dumbed down, not just the tests. Well, this announcement coincides with the release of a paper by a team of scholars on grade inflation led by Jeff Denning, an economist at the University of Texas in Austin, Texas. And it's entitled Easy A's, Less Pay, The Long-Term Effects of Grade Inflation. Now, this is one of the first scholarly works to really show in detail and convincingly the long-term effects of great inflation. So I'm very pleased to have Jeff Denning with me on the Education Exchange today. Thanks for joining me, Jeff.
Thanks for having me.
Well, Jeff, we're going to dig into your data and your methodology in just a minute, but can you first tell our listeners what they really want to know? And your title sort of suggests it. Do students benefit from grade inflation?
No, is the short answer. There's more complication to that, but it does not look like they benefit.
All right. So now, are you studying grade inflation in high school or are you studying it in college?
This study focuses on high school.
And where?
We use data from LA, Los Angeles Unified School District, and the state of Maryland, and have slightly different data in both of those places, but use both of those places to answer this question.
Well, yeah, those are two widespread, very different places, which I guess is good because you know what's going on the East Coast and the West Coast. But how do you get access to this information? It's not easy to get inside dope like this.
So my collaborator, so I have some collaborators on this, Rachel Nesbit, Nolan Pope, and Merrill Warnick. Nolan has worked with the LA data for some time. And I should have a shorter answer for exactly how he got that. I believe he got it through an open records request or something similar. And we gained access to the Maryland data through a longitudinal data system that Maryland maintains that researchers can access with a proposal and these sorts of things.
So can others do what you have just done? So let's say somebody doesn't believe you. Can they check up on you?
In Maryland, if they can gain access, I'm not the person who did all of the work to gain access, so I'm not sure all of the stipulations. I think you might have to be in Maryland to access it or something like that. But other people can certainly access it. It's not just us.
Well, so let me ask whether you think we can draw any inferences from Maryland and Los Angeles about what's happening nationwide. Do you think this is telling us something larger than just these two places?
Yeah, I would argue it is. I think you alluded to one of the reasons, which is these are two very different settings. LA, they're on different coasts. They have different student populations. Los Angeles Unified is largely a Hispanic school district. Most of the students are Hispanic. Maryland has schools that have students from a lot of different backgrounds: urban schools, rural schools, students of different socioeconomic backgrounds. So I think I think the fact that we have both of them is very nice, and I think that they tell a similar story when we have data from both places is also very nice.
So And what are the effects of grade inflation that you're looking at? Is this college enrollments, earnings? What are some of the outcome variables that you're including in your analysis?
Yeah, we have a lot of outcomes that we consider. We start kind of with shorter term things like performance on tests in the next year, um, things like absences and suspensions, graduation from high school, um, taking the SAT, and then we also have in Maryland, we're able to go into longer term outcomes like uh, college enrollment, college completion, and then ultimately earnings. So we have quite a lot of, we have outcomes at kind of different points in time that follow students as they progress through education and into the labor market.
Well, so what's your measure of grade inflation? I think you actually talk about two different measures, so maybe you could explain these two different measures that you are using.
Yeah, so we have two measures, like you say. One we call mean grade inflation or average grade inflation, and one we call passing grade inflation. Teachers can, just to be clear, these measures are at the teacher level. So we're thinking about kind of an individual teacher's propensity to inflate grades or not. Um, and we're thinking for mean grade inflation, kind of the how on average are they raising grades higher or lower? So you could imagine a teacher that just kind of gives out higher grades or lower grades kind of to everybody. But you could also imagine a different teacher who does a lot of different things, actually. They could make it really easy to get an A, but hard to get a B, or, that would be kind of a silly one, but you could think of lots of different ones. And so we're focusing on a particular one, which is a teacher who makes it easier to pass their class. So we have, and we call that passing grade inflation. The idea
Oh,
is
is
that
this getting a D instead of an F?
that's right, getting a D instead of an F. The reason that we're interested in that particularly is that failing in class has big consequences for the student in terms of their ability to progress through school and to graduate, that sort of thing. And you can think that's a place where passing or where grade inflation may be particularly beneficial, right? It may help a student on the margin of an F to a D to get that D and then pass the class, get their diploma, et cetera. So we wanted to look at that particular margin. So we have on average inflation and inflation at that passing margin.
So your average one is sort of the overall picture, and then the passing one is one that focuses at the very bottom, those who are in danger of not getting through high school.
That's right.
So, Harvard does the same thing as you because if I fail somebody, I get into big time trouble. So I'm under tremendous pressure to give those D minuses. But but they don't, you know, if I give too many Bs, they even though they have been very tolerant of grade inflation, they don't care whether I give an A or a B particularly, although recently that's begun to change. So I think actually I like your distinction there. I think you're making the right kind of looking at those two things separately makes a lot of sense because I think teachers think about it that way.
Yeah, I mean, I would be, I teach students in my role as a professor here. And I certainly think about kind of all of the choices I'm making, but in particular, I think about failing and passing as a very, important distinction. And then, and so we really wanted to focus on that in addition to kind of overall inflation.
So now, how much variation among teachers are there? Are there some teachers who are really tough and they haven't inflated, they're giving the same number of A's and B's and C's that they gave 20 years ago, and others have become increasingly lax? Can you can you spot the teachers that are inflation prone?
Um, Yes, so there's a couple of different questions in there. Yes, we think we can. We develop a method that has a lot of similarities to teacher value added. For any of your listeners that know about what that is, but it's a statistical model that allows us to kind of identify these teachers. And we're to be clear, when we use the term grade inflation, we're kind of comparing one teacher to another, not necessarily over time. So all of this relies on our ability to be able to distinguish teachers who inflate grades versus teachers who don't. We have substantial variation in our data set for teachers who inflate grades and teachers who don't. Um, it's about zero point 0.2 GPA points to 0.4 GPA points is a standard deviation. So um, that's a meaningful amount of variation across teachers. There's a second part to your question that I'm not forgetting, but yes, that's the variation.
Well, I was sort of talking about the variation over time. And so do you have any data on, because I hear what you just said, says you can compare one teacher to another at any given point in time. Now, how about, do we have evidence that in Maryland and Los Angeles there has been a lot of grade inflation?
In the paper, we show that average grades are going up over time in both places. And we show that kind of average grades for students who score similarly well on standardized tests are going up over time. So students around the median on the standardized tests their grades are going up. Students who are doing really well, their grades are going up. So we definitely confirm kind of broader trends there. I think we don't view one of the main contributions of our paper as really establishing how much of that is due to easier grading versus something else that might be happening. We're looking at kind of this across teacher variation.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. But the cross-teacher variation, let me ask a little bit about that. Does this vary by subject matter? Are science teachers tougher? At Harvard, the science teachers are not inflating nearly as much as the people in the humanities and the social sciences.
Yeah, so that's a good question. We are using data basically from two types of classes in this study, math and English language arts classes. So, and that has to do with the way we construct the measures, which relies on us having test scores in those subjects. And so those are the subjects that we have test scores in. We in general combine those measures into kind of a student's experience in a given year in both of those classes. We don't find very strong differences in our results in math or English on the effects of them. I don't know offhand what the distributions of grade inflation is in those two different subjects. But we could look it up. We don't, it's just not in the paper currently.
Well, how about variation across schools? Is the inflation greater in the sort of schools that are heavily populated by more advantaged students or less advantaged students?
So we have not looked at that directly in our study. I think other people have done that. So Seth Gershenson has a very nice paper a few years back that tries to characterize inflation. And it depends a little bit on what you mean by inflation. Is it relative to a standard? Is it relative to what it was 10 years ago? But we're focusing really on the teacher level in this study, and we hope others and perhaps ourselves in the future focus more on these kind of school level concerns.
Well, if focusing on the teacher, one of the things that occurs to me is, does it vary by whether it's a male teacher or a female teacher?
We haven't looked at
Gender
that.
a
Oh, sorry.
factor? Yeah.
We haven't looked at that. We we have looked at one thing, which is related to this. We're limited somewhat by what teacher characteristics we can observe. One we can observe is how long you've been teaching. And teachers who have taught for longer tend to inflate grades less.
Oh, so it's the beginning teachers who give the easier grades.
That's right.
And now, how about the ones that are weaker? Because you have the value added data. It's interesting that you have calculated the value added of a teacher, which is basically, I think what you're showing is how much does the student learn this year? How much higher is the score this year as compared to what it was the previous year? So from that, you sort of calculate whether or not the student was in a class where they learned quite a bit or didn't learn much at all. And so you have this value added measure, which has sort of been taken as a pretty good measure of how effective a teacher is. So are the effective teachers the easier graders?
They are not, is the short answer. We are able to correlate teacher value added and teacher grade inflation measures. And we find that they are not strongly correlated, but they are negatively correlated. That is, if you have a higher teacher value added, you teach your students learn more as measured by test scores, you're going to be a harsher grader on average.
I like that finding. I really like it because I'm a bit of a harsh grader. So I must be a good teacher.
Well, it's not a perfect correlation, unfortunately, but it is that is the correlation. The other thing I will say is we also have teacher non-cognitive value added, which is it measures how much teachers do things like help their student attend classes and other kind of not test score outcomes. That was my co-author Nolan Pope did a lot of work on this. And we find that grade inflating teachers have slightly higher, very slightly higher non-cognitive value added.
So you make your students feel better if you are an easier grader.
Well, I don't know about feel better, but this measure of non-cognitive value added is things like absences and that sort of thing. So we do see a positive correlation there, though I should state it's not a strong one. So you could imagine there might be a trade-off, and that was kind of when we were coming into the study. There might be a trade-off. If I'm harsh, my students might study to learn more, but then if I'm too harsh, then maybe I don't help them develop these other non-cognitive skills. And yeah.
So the non-cognitive skills, I've always not liked that phrase. I think this was invented by some economist at the University of Chicago, Jim Heckman, I think it was. That I hated that word because all it means is that it's not test scores.
That's what we mean by it. Yep.
So what do you mean by non-cognitive? Do you mean that is absentee? You mentioned absenteeism there. Or is there a questionnaire or something where they say some things about their social and emotional well-being?
So they're slightly different in the two different data sets we have. What we construct, and we are able to construct value add to absences, suspension, grade retention, and academic GPA. And then in LA, we were able to create two additional ones, which is cooperation and effort GPA. So how much you cooperate, how much effort you exert. Are you suspended? Do you have absences? Those sorts of things. That's what's in non-cognitive. We use an index, so we're not looking at any of those separately, but we use kind of an index of these measures.
Well, how about that passing inflation measure you have? If you let students at least get a D minus or a G instead of an F, does that help them in this regard then?
Sorry, in which regard?
Well, in terms of their social and emotional well-being or their absenteeism rate or some of these non-cognitive domains.
So we look at the effects of both mean grade inflation and passing grade inflation while holding fixed the teacher's teacher value added and their teacher non-cognitive value added. And we say, does grade inflation of those two types have an additional effect over and beyond what they see in non-cognitive value added from their teacher and cognitive value added? So I can talk about those results if you want, but just to be clear, what we're doing, this is holding fixed to teachers non-cognitive value added and teacher value added. What's the effect of grade inflation?
So then the effect of inflation of the passing grade one is?
So for passing, we find that students are more likely to pass the class, to avoid being held back. Okay, so they're not being administratively marked as repeating a grade. Passing, if you have a passing grade inflating teacher, you're more likely to graduate high school. And then, so we see those effects. And those are kind of the effects that we predicted you might find, that you're more likely to pass the class, more likely to graduate high school. And then we look to see what happens longer term. We see that students have slightly higher earnings when they first start out in the labor market, though these effects kind of fade after 3 or 4 years. So there seems to be kind of some effect that is helpful to students, or it looks helpful to students initially, but it doesn't look like those effects are persistent. They don't last for a long time.
So you don't see that help that shows up in the short term really has some long-term effects. Let's talk about some of those long-term effects. How about the college enrollment and college persistence, college graduation? Does grade inflation have a seriously negative effect on your chances of going to college or completing college?
Mean grade inflation, so average grade inflation, reduces the chance that you enroll in post-secondary education. Um, and it doesn't affect whether or not you graduate from post-secondary education, but you're less likely to go. It does reduce the chance that you are employed, and it does reduce the chance, and it reduces your earnings. So in the long term, mean grade inflation doesn't look to be benefiting students in these measures that, enrollment, earnings, that sort of thing.
So whether you're talking about enrolling in college or completing in college or getting a job or earning on the job, you're finding negative effects of a overall increase in the inflation rate by a particular teacher, or if you have a teacher who is more likely to inflate than another teacher.
That's right, with one small caveat that we don't see negative effects or positive effects on graduating from college, but all the rest of them are negative.
It does not have an effect on graduation rates, but that does on, is that graduation's rates conditional on entry into college?
No.
Just the overall graduation rates.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's ask this question, because it was in your abstract that it's the effects of a teacher having a teacher, students having a teacher who is a big time non-deflator, right? One that really holds the line, that will help all of our students by over $200,000 per year.
That's right. So
Did I get that right?
that's right. So you can say it either way. You can either say a student, a teacher who inflates grades harms their students' earnings by, or a teacher who doesn't inflate grades, has lower grades, helps their students by about $200,000 per year per teacher. I want to mention how we got that so it's a little clear what it is exactly. That is taking the effect we see for students and then aggregating them up to the number of students a teacher teaches. So a teacher in our data set teaches about 90 students per year. So we take the effect on earnings that we see, we apply it to 90 students, and then we apply it over their lifetime. We assume that what we see on earnings kind of keeps going. That's an assumption. Who knows if it's right or wrong? But that we assume that, and then that's how we get this number. So it's saying one teacher, if they inflate grades, they influence about 90 students, it reduces their earnings. And this is kind of a back of the envelope way to see how much it is.
Well, that's a big number, but maybe it would be good to put out what is it for one student? If you have one teacher who is deflating, I mean, is inflating, and is especially inclined in that direction. There's a standard deviation difference between her and the average teacher. So how big of an impact is it on just one student?
It's approximately a reduction in earnings for that one student of 1% a year. So 0.9%.
Well,
So it's not a
1%.
huge effect for one student. The thing is, teachers, as is the case with teacher value added, teachers affect lots and lots of students, and so their impact, both positive or negative, is going to be felt by lots of students, and hence there's a big impact of it.
Right. But I just want to calculate it for one student because I don't want this to be an unbelievable finding. So for one student, it's if a 1%, I mean, let's say somebody's income could be, let's say the average income is around 60,000 or something like that. 1% would be what, 600
Yeah,
bucks.
something like that
Yeah.
per year.
Well, it's non-trivial, and you think about what if you had a whole host of teachers like that? Then you're talking about thousands.
That's right. I mean, you don't even need a whole host of teachers. Just teachers affect a lot of students, right? So if one teacher does this, they affect 90 students. All 90 of their students, on average, are losing 1% of their earnings. So that's, to society, a pretty big effect. Um, and I should note, like this calculation we borrow from the teacher value added folks, and they find kind of similarly, I don't, roughly similar kinds of effects of teacher value added. Kind of
Well, do we know if
all,
these,
sorry.
yeah, do we know if these effects are the same across ethnic groups? Are they the same for white, black, Asian students?
We've explored looking at the results differently for different ethnic groups. We can do that in Maryland. We can't do it in LA. And we don't find strong patterns of differences across student race or ethnicity.
So whoever you are, whatever your color, whatever your ethnic background, grade inflation is not good. Is that what you're saying?
It does not, mean grade inflation does not seem to be helpful to students in terms of their earnings, just regardless of kind of their race or ethnic background.
So we can't sort of say that this is it's a trade-off between equality and productivity. You're not getting any equalizing impact of grade inflation because some people have said, well, grade inflation is really maybe have some negative, but it's got some positive things in the fact that those who are disadvantaged are going to benefit or at least not be harmed as much as others. But you don't find that.
We don't find differences by race or ethnicity. We do find some differences about the impacts of passing grade inflation by how prepared you were in 8th grade. So if you're a student on the at risk of failing, your effect on high school graduation of having a passing grade inflating teacher is higher, as you might imagine, than someone who's not at risk of failing. But we generally don't find strong differences across different kinds of students.
And you don't find any difference. You don't have any data on the social background, the income of the parents, or the education of the parents of the students, right?
We don't have education. We do have free and reduced price lunch status, and we don't find strong patterns by that either.
So you don't see any strong evidence that those who are in need of free and reduced lunch, which would be the low-income students, are affected in a different way from those who are not eligible for that.
Correct.
Well, what do you think are the policy consequences? What do you recommend to the policymaker?
The first thing I'll say is that this is a complicated issue with lots of stakeholders, but I think the first thing I'd recommend is start talking about it. Start thinking about these trade-offs that you're making in terms of inflating grades. I think we demonstrate there are real costs to inflating grades to students. It's unclear. There are other papers that have said, one in particular that say, like, if you change policy on grade inflation in K-12, what happens? It's unclear exactly what would happen depending on how you implemented the policy, but I would encourage people to, if I were giving advice to a policymaker, I'd say you should start thinking about this and trying to mitigate the negative effects of grade inflation.
So what's the caveats? Is there anything about the way you've analyzed the data that you think could be biased or could have led you to this finding, which might be erroneous?
We've tried very hard to avoid that, but there's a lot of. I invite people, if they're interested, to read the paper. We've done a lot of work to kind of validate these measures and compare them to well-established measures of teacher characteristics. They behave really similarly in some ways to teacher value added, and so we think they look pretty good. We've presented it to rooms of people who are often skeptical of these sorts of things, and they've given us things to work on, but we feel good about the claims that we've made. So there's not one that immediately comes to mind, but we're just starting the journal submission process, so I'm sure someone will suggest something we should try.
Well, I think you've certainly added to the discussion because at Harvard there's been an effort to at least stop continuing inflation, or maybe even to move backwards to deflate. And so there's been some response by students who say, well, this is going to hurt me. I mean, we're already so stressed out from just getting to Harvard and just, why can't we just sort of relax and enjoy our educational experience? Why do you have to push this getting a good grade onto us? So what do you say to students who say that?
I understand it. I've been a student. I know. I understand that impulse for sure. I think so. Just as a little bit of background, I started working, I mostly worked in higher ed, and I wrote a paper about grade inflation in college. And the results of that paper made me want to see if it was good or bad for students. Um, and the more I've thought about it in college, which is not this, subject of this paper, it's really hard to find who is going to argue for more uh, strict grades. Students are going to be like, hey, I would prefer, I mean, at least all the students I've taught are like, it'd be great if everyone got an A in this class. That'd be nice for me. As you mentioned, professors face incentives to not fail their students. Deans and department chairs would like there to be students who are passing. They're competing across the campus to try to attract students so they don't want to send them away. University presidents like to tout that their graduation rate is going up. So it's unclear who is the constituency for tough grades. I think we demonstrate that it is perhaps the students in the future, that's the interest that we should be thinking about, but that can be hard to feel in the moment as a student. So I would encourage them to think about kind of, the future as well, and how stricter grades might help them in terms of developing their skills and that sort of thing.
Well, one conclusion that I have reached is that you can't leave this up to the individual teacher or the individual professor because they are very sensitive to what is going on around them. So if you're going to deflate, if you're going to try to push against this propensity, which you have properly identified here, because there's nobody who's going to sort of argue that you're doing a terrible thing. So it's got to come in a coordinated effort, and a coordinated effort has to come from the center. So can you imagine college presidents or boards of trustees or top level administrators, provosts actually sort of speaking to the faculty and saying, you must do this? Would you recommend that?
Um, I totally agree that that stopping grade inflation in college is going to have to come from some sort of central authority, not the individual professors. Um, can I see them doing this? I don't. I can't forecast what my dean or provost or will do. I think in some higher ed spaces in higher ed at the moment, there's a sense that if grade inflation continues or is at very high levels, there's a risk of losing credibility, and then you could imagine that central administrators might care. But it's very hard to make faculty do anything, it turns out. So it's not an easy problem to solve.
Well, now some people say, well, let's just start giving higher grades. So we could have A plus and A plus plus, A plus plus plus. Um, is that a solution?
It could be. I mean, I don't know, moving the goalpost basically, or moving the measuring stick, or whatever the right thing is. It depends on how fast people change. I think the incentives that individuals face, that departments face, that colleges face, still will exist if we gave higher grades. So I think, that my guess, it's a guess, would be that would be temporary at best, not like a permanent solution.
That's not a long-term solution to solving the problem that there's a long-term negative effect of great inflation in our high schools, at least as observed in Maryland and Los Angeles. So, well, thank you very much, Jeff, for joining me on the Education Exchange.
Thank you.
I've been speaking with Jeff Denning, an economist at the University of Texas in Austin, Texas. He and his co-authors have just released a paper entitled Easy A's, Less Pay, The Long-Term Effects of Great Inflation. His co-authors are Rachel Nesbit, Nolan Pope, Merrill Warnick. And so thank you very much for joining me on the Education Exchange.
Thank you.
I am Paul Peterson. This is the Education Exchange. Please join me for a new podcast released on the Education X website every Monday at noon Eastern Time.